The introduction of cell phones, I really believe, has changed the entire landscape of how we communicate as a society, as people. And with the introduction of cell phones, we're able to see things that are happening more quickly. And that response to the assassination of George Floyd was a gut reaction response. And not only within our own community, it happened, that reaction response, it was like a ripple effect that happened across the country. And in the process, I began to get many phone calls from very, I believe that we live in a multi-ethnic, multicultural, diverse society, and my life is of such. And so my white friends who I love and respect and who are doing good work in this world and are good people in this world, many of them started calling me and asking me, Dr. Verna, how do I talk? What do I do? What am I supposed to do about this? How do I talk about this? What is going on? Could you help me? And I received enough of those calls. I received enough of those calls for me to realize that it was time to have that conversation. And have that conversation specifically with white people who are ready to do the work. As we do this presentation today, I am walking you through exactly what is racism, what is it, so that you know what you are talking about, or at least you're beginning the conversation. Hey, Miss Marcia, it's good to see you on. Hey, Pat's good to see you on. And as we do the conversation, then I will build out from there, looking at what is racism into specifically how do you talk about it? How do you talk about it? Now, most of you on the phone or online, I have either talked to or have met, and some of you on the line, I have never talked to, I've never seen you before, I've never met you before. So this is our first coming together. So I'm just gonna give, on contracts where they have those really, really tiny prints at the bottom of the contract that basically says, okay, here's what I want you to know about me. I am real, I'm for real, I'm authentic. I have launched into this work because I feel in my spirit like this is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm supposed to have this conversation. And here's how I know that I was on the right track. First of all, many media people decided that they wanted to call me about it. Secondly, for the first time in my professional career as a speaker teacher, Facebook blocked my ad. I could not believe it. I felt like, what exactly happened? And Facebook said that my ad, because it said white people in it, and because it said racism in it, was racially and politically motivated, and that they would not run my ad. At first I was like, hold it, what is going on here? And then I thought to myself, it's kind of like little kids when they skin their knees when they're riding their bikes, and then they start talking to someone and then they say, it's like bragging rights. So I feel as though I have like a few bragging rights here because Facebook actually blocked my ad. And that made me know that we just might be doing the right thing here. So there are some hard things that you will hear in this conversation because racism is a hard conversation to have. This is not a full conversation. You will not get every detail, every historical fact. You cannot get that in 1 hour. That is years of work. Thirdly, I want you to open up your heart and open up your mind and allow this work to become a part of who you are, how you are, and allow yourself to step into this space to actually start the conversation. My work in this place of racism really, I think, started a long, long time ago. I am born and raised in the Bahamas. And when I first came to this country, I was 10 years old, going on 11 years old. And as an immigrant, I didn't know I was an immigrant. I just knew that my parents moved here to the country, and guess what? I was in America, and everyone told me that in America, everything was perfect, and everyone was rich, and everything was wonderful. And so as a young child, I literally had to see for myself. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I saw some things happening. I saw that some people were treated one way and other people treated the other way. Let me get real specific. I saw that teachers treated white children one way and children who were brown, children who were black, children who were non-white another way. I began to see this. I didn't quite know exactly what it was because no one had ever had a conversation with me about race or racism. It wasn't in my bones or in my fiber that somehow I was less than a person because I wasn't the right color. That was never how I was taught or who I was taught to be. So I began to see this and it was really confusing. And then later on in my career, something very interesting started to happen. And here's what started to happen. I would go places with my African-American brothers and sisters. When I say African-American brothers and sisters, I'm talking about African people of African descent who are born and raised here in the United States of America, who we refer to as African-American and or Black. And my friends and I, we would go places. And in those places, of course, if you're joining us here and you're in Minnesota, know that Minnesota is still 89 or so percent Caucasian, white American. So if you are in urban Minneapolis or urban St. Paul or some of these other pockets where there are larger communities of non-white people, you would think, oh, we're really, really, really diverse. We're really ethnically diverse. The truth is that we're really not in Minnesota. Okay, so the reality is that wherever I go, I see white people. Why? Because I'm in Minnesota. Now, if I took you to the Bahamas, wherever you went, you would see Black people. Why? Because you're in the Bahamas. Why? It's a state of demographics in Minnesota. So I would go places and a white person would say something to me and then they would say something to my African-American friend and they would say something like, you know, oh, you have a little accent. Where are you from? And without knowing, I would just say, oh, I'm from the Bahamas. And the most fascinating thing would happen. Literally, it was as if the lights went out, like we were on a stage and half the stage went dark. And they literally, and I'm not talking about one time, twice, I am talking about, a pattern of behavior here. And literally, my African-American Black friends, they would get shut off. And it was as if the white people would just forget that they were there. And they would focus on me and it would become like a wow session. Wow, you're from the Bahamas? Wow, then you must be like a different kind of Black people, right? And so then I can talk to you because you're a different kind of Black people, but those other Black people, we're just not going to deal with them. I didn't know what I was seeing. All I'm telling you is this is what I was experiencing. I'm going to move forward. I'm in college. I went to St. Paul Bible College, which is now Crown College. Crown College is located in St. Bonifacius and right between St. Bonifacius and Waconia. At the time that I went to college, there were 5 African-American Black students on campus. 5, 900 students, 5 of us. While we were on the campus was very, very careful to almost like protect us from racism. While we were in the community, it was something totally different. I'm in the store, I'm buying my ramen noodles or whatever I'm buying that college kids buy. At that time, my hair right now, it's in a twisty, it's kind of twisted up. It's called natural hair. But at that time, I had an afro. So if you can imagine, big afro, I'm in the grocery aisle, I'm doing my thing. I am not paying attention to what's going on around me. I'm just there to do my shopping and go back to the college campus. Along comes this woman, and she's a white woman, and she has a white child, and her child is sitting in the front of the grocery cart, and that child, she's just a pretty little girl. She has blonde hair, she has blue eyes, she's just bright, she's just like shining, like a little light in the store. And the child comes, the woman comes by me with her cart. And the child reaches out to me, she touches my hair, and she says to her mother, "Ooh, mommy, it's brown and it has poofy hair." Okay? Now, what happened next, I was not prepared for. And the mother, this is just a baby, she may have been 3 years old, maybe at the most 4. The mother reached out and she slapped that child across the face. And she took her cart and she whipped down that aisle and ran away with the child, screaming, crying, and her life was changed forever. Now let's move that scenario 30 years forward. 30 years forward, I'm the superintendent of a major public school district, or I am a professor at the University of Minnesota, and here comes this young white woman into my classroom, and she is now training to be a teacher in urban public schools. Question: what's in her mind as she sees, maybe for the first time, her first ever African-American professor? Question: what is in her mind? I'm going to move forward. I become a speaker, a national, internationally known speaker. My assistant happened to be a white woman. We show up at the event. I'm the speaker. This was before we had Google and you can search me up and look at my YouTube and all of that stuff. I come to the event. The organizers come to my assistant, who is a white woman, and says to her, "Hello, Dr. Verna, so nice to meet you. I am so glad you came. You can tell your assistant to take your things over there." Now, of course, my white colleague, right? She was appalled. She could not, and you know, white people, when white people, a lot of white people, when you get really upset and really kind of, you know, these red blotches start coming up on your neck and, you know, just your face kind of reddens up, and she just went into, like, you know, white panic attack. She's like, "I cannot believe this, Dr. Verna." She apologized to me, but the truth was, it wasn't for her to apologize to me. She was trying to cover for her white brothers and sisters who were steeped in something called racism, who were steeped in unknowingly thinking that the only way you could have a speaker is that she has to be a white woman. She could not possibly be a Black woman with an earned PhD from the University of Minnesota. She couldn't possibly be, right? So why am I telling you these stories? Because for some of us, we think that racism, it just kind of happened. Well, you know, the police shot George Floyd. No, they assassinated George Floyd. And secondly, this is not the first time this has happened. This has been a pattern of police brutality in our country for a long, long, long time. So what I want you to do is to know that racism is not an isolated event. So if you're taking notes, I want you to write that down. Racism is not an isolated event. It is a systemic issue that we all must live with. Now, having said that, I'm actually going to go to share a slide with you in which I'm just going to walk you through some information. And like I said, please, put your thoughts and your comments in the chat box. And then what I'm going to do is, as I share the screen, I'll come back and we'll think and talk together again as we get new information. So, okay. So what I was just sharing with you are just my reflections on racism, right? And the fact that I've experienced it, I know I've been there, I live it every day. So why are we doing this work? There has been an awakening by white people around racism and the effects of racism that racism is having in our country. Racism is having in our families. Racism is having in our neighborhoods. And really there's a need for foundational changes. And when I say foundational changes, I mean at the very core level of our existence, of our society. There's also a need for education. I am amazed by how little how little people know about what racism is, how it works, how it has impacted our society and every day impacts you as a white person, and how you as a white person knowingly and or unknowingly perpetuate racism in so many ways. Why this work? We need strategies. Here's the deal. No one has all of the answers. Collectively, we have the answer, but we need strategies. And why this work? We need to take action. And when this is all said and done, my white brothers and sisters, when this is all said and done, my brothers and sisters on the line, I want you to know that I want to work with you to take those action steps. This is not just a talk. I am not interested in a talk. And for those of you who know me, you know that I am interested in taking action and creating change. Here are a few guiding truths around racism. One, there's only one race, only one. It's the human race. It is the human race. I have traveled across the world. And because at some point in my life, I had to learn to forgive white Americans, white people in America who literally have continued to perpetuate this thing called racism. I've had to forgive white people, which is why I can openly talk to white people about racism, because in my heart is pure. I'm not mad, I'm not angry, I'm not sick, I'm not sad, my hair is not falling out because I'm like, oh, about this. No, I know who you are. You are a human being. There's one race, there's the human race. The second guiding truth is that race is a political construct. It has nothing to do with science. When you peel back the skin, and I'm telling you, our sicknesses and diseases that have plagued us across time, when you pull back the skin, when you go on the hospital ward, every person in that hospital needs the same thing. They need help to get better, and they use the same medicines, and they take the same blood. Behind us, behind this layer of skin, we are all 99.99999% the same. So race is a political construct which was created by white people, and let me just say wealthy white people in power positions, to do what? To divide humanity into how many categories? 2 categories. Let me say that again. Race is a political construct created by white people, wealthy white people, in power positions to divide humanity into 2 categories. 2 categories: a superior category of people called white people, and an inferior category of people, all other people. I'm going to say particularly Black people because I'm focusing on the United States of America, where inferior has been connected to Black people since the beginning of time in this country. And so inferior, that other category, we're going to come back to that. The third guiding truth about racism is that race was created by white people as a mechanism to unfairly classify all other people as inferior. And when I say unfairly, unfairly is exactly it. Because if you have a superior race, then of course you must have an inferior race, and that superior race then must become the ones who rule the inferior people. So these are all guiding truths. Now you may say, Dr. Verna, I don't agree with you. It's fine. You don't have to agree with me. This is not an argument. This is not a discussion. It really isn't. I'm just telling you the guiding truths. And when it's said and done, what you will get to do is you will get to figure out those truths for yourself as well. The fourth guiding truth is that racism have become a paradigm in which laws, policies, systems, institutions, and negative discriminatory social behaviors could be practiced and perpetrated. So when I say foundational, I mean that racism then became the foundation because race, superior and inferior, became the paradigm on which all of the laws. So the laws then perpetuated practices that were helpful to white people, the policies, perpetuated practices helpful to white people, the systems and so forth and so on. These are guiding truths about race and racism. Let me move on. Racism fundamentals is what I call this. Now we're talking, when we're done here today, I am giving you strategies on how to have this conversation. This is being recorded right now, and it's going to be available to you. So you get to come back and you get to review and you get to kind of think and talk with yourself about how to even start the conversations. First of all, racism is real. Secondly, it's evident in and at every level of society. Third, it is embedded in our system. It's systemic, it's institutional, it's political. It is taught and caught. It's an amazing thing what happens when you think about being caught and taught. In other words, what happens within racism is that, you know, my 3-year-old sitting in that shopping cart, no one had to tell her anymore. No one had to tell her that racism had taken place. It was caught. And in that moment, she was being taught. And with our children are catching from us how we perceive race, how we connect, how we perpetuate racism, how we perpetuate the privileges that racism brings us. It is being taught to our children and it is being caught. How is it that today in 2020, that you could have a 17-year-old boy, he's just a boy, right? That he would somehow figure out how to arm himself, weaponize himself to go and kill the people who are trying to do something about racism. How is it? He's only 17 years old. I have 4 children. My twins are 18 years old. They're still children. So what does that say to me? That says that racism has been perpetuated in our society and it is caught and taught. Racism also, it's amazing to me. It really, really is amazing to me. And it's so hard, you know, it's a silent destroyer. It's a silent destroyer. One of our participants on the call today, she sent me a note and she said, I am like so sick of all the privileges. And I'm just done with all the privileges that being white affords us in this society, because it simply does. And when we look at the reality that racism, race, whiteness affords you major privileges in this society, it becomes a silent destroyer. You don't even realize it's happening. And what I want you to write on your paper is I want you to write the word intention. Racism cannot be eradicated. Racism cannot be undone without intention. And it will take the intention of white people to make it happen. Here's why. It took the intention of white people to put it in place. And what makes us think that the inferior people from this paradigm of race gets to undo what the superior people in this paradigm of race has done? No, in this work, white people who put the process in place must also do the work to undo the process. Racism has strong roots. It has strong roots. And it is, unfortunately, racism produces its own. Racism produces racist, and racist produces more racist, and it perpetuates itself. Racism costs. The cost of racism in this country is phenomenal. If we did the math, truly did the math, we are paying in a major way for racism. Racism thrives on power. It needs power to exist, and it is perpetuated by white people, as I have said that before. I'm going to show you just a couple of different ways that people kind of think about racism here. Breathe a little bit here. Okay, racism paradigms. On one side, racism is institutional. It's embedded in institutions. On the other side, racism is individual. We have institutions that are racist and have racism practices, and we have individuals who are racist and have racist practices. Racism can be explicit. In other words, in sociology, explicit simply means we are teaching our children. We are actually putting explicit laws and practices in place to make sure that racism stays in place. Now, one might say that police brutality is an explicit paradigm. It's an explicit paradigm. Someone asked me the question, what would have been an appropriate response for the mother in the store? I'm going to get to that toward the end of the conversation. Racism is an explicit paradigm. Racism is public. We have seen public demonstrations of racism, and when racism becomes normal, it is difficult to trace it because it's embedded in all of our systems. On the other hand, racism is individual. It can be implicit without you even realizing it's there. Like, have you ever had a racist moment as a white person? And you realize afterwards, that was a racist moment. I just perpetuated racism. What is going on with me? Have you ever had that moment? Tell me about it in the chat box. Racism can be private. You have people who publicly, they look like they are doing the right thing and saying the right thing. Privately, they are racist to the core. And racism also creates privileges. Now, let me just talk about privilege for a second. If you haven't done any work around privilege, I recommend some of the greatest work that I've read around privilege is from Peggy McIntosh, and she writes around white privilege. It's an old work. She didn't just start it. She has been doing the work for quite some time. And in the work, Peggy basically says that we as white people have white privilege, and that white privilege perpetuates racism on a continual basis. I have at the end of this presentation resources. Peggy McIntosh is one of those resources. I recommend that you read every privilege that she came up with so that you can see for yourself what are the privileges. Now, if I were doing a full course on how white people can talk about racism, I would have you list all of your privileges. List them with your whiteness. What is afforded you because of your whiteness? White privilege fuels, fosters, feeds, and sustains racism. On your paper, please write, what white privileges do I walk in every day? It's a privilege to go into a store and know that more than likely, at least 80% of the store managers will be white. So if you ask for a manager, what you're really asking is, I want to talk to a white person about this. That's a privilege. And there are many, many more. Now, let me talk about what racism is not. I'm putting my slides back up here so that you can actually see this as we think and talk through it. What racism is not. If you're bold and brave enough, which I think you are, send me a white privilege that you walk in every day. In the chat box. Okay, racism is not the same as prejudice. Let's be clear about that. So I'll find white people who say to me, well, I'm not prejudiced. Okay, that's fine. But you're still racist. Why? Because of the systemic and institutional foundation that racism is built on and where you fit into that. Absolutely. Now, the question is this: are you perpetuating racism? Are you intentionally perpetuating racism? Now, you can tell me, Dr. Verna, I am not. I am not, perpetuating racism with intention. But racism is not prejudice. Prejudice is simply an opinion formed before the facts are known. It's a preconceived idea. It's a prejudgment, usually one that is unfavorable about one social, ethnic, and or cultural group. Now, question, can I, as a Black person, can I be prejudiced? Absolutely. Can I have a prejudgment? Absolutely. Can I have a preconceived idea? Absolutely. Can I be a racist? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because I am not a part of the system that perpetuates, it has the power to perpetuate racism in this country. Racism is not the same as discrimination. People get these things mixed up as well. What is discrimination? It's an action. It's usually negative, taken against another on the basis of prejudice. That is not racism. Let me get to what racism is. Racism, and this definition comes from a work, and I would say it's kind of one of these small books. My husband says it's kind of like my first book, The Power of People, 4 Kinds of People Can Change Your Life. And it is, it's a small book that was written by a gentleman called Ronald Chisholm and Michael Washington many, many years ago. It's called Undoing Racism. And I really, and my husband took his time to kind of help me think, and he's been helping me think and walk through this now for a while. And I really, when I took a look at his paradigm, his definition of racism, I really liked it. And here's what he said, that racism, write this down, please. Racism equals, write it down, race prejudice plus power. Let me say that again. Racism equals race prejudice plus power. What does that mean? Race prejudice, then, is your preconceived unfavorable attitudes and actions against other people. Who are other people? Non-white people, particularly Black people. And these race prejudices are supported, listen carefully, they are supported and upheld by the power of the law. They are put into the system in which the law dictates how, and systems dictate, and institutions dictate how and who we are and how we function. So this race prejudice is actually embedded. And why do I believe, what am I saying is, let's go back to our race. There's one human race, but race as a political construct says that there are 2. So then when you have an inferior, then you have a prejudice, a racial prejudice to that inferior. And so what that means then is that the whole body of the law, of the society, of the systems, of the institutions actually upholds that racial prejudice. So race equals racial prejudice. Then you ask yourself the question, do you have racial prejudice? You have to ask yourself that question, plus power. Now, why do I say power? Because it takes power to keep racism in place. Racism is kept in place because of our power structures. In our courts, racism is kept in place. Look at mass incarceration. In education, racism is kept in place. Look at the achievement gap. In police brutality, racism is kept in place. Look at what is going on with the assassination of our brothers and sisters across this country. It is in our courts, racism is kept in place. Look to see who gets off on bail, who doesn't, who goes to prison, who doesn't. Let's take a look. It isn't kept in place by power. So I want you to know that racism, and to be careful. So when you're having these conversations, know that people, white people in particular, are going to try to say racism is this and that. You know what it is, and I want you to continue to do your work. Let me talk about the power constructs of racism, and I'm going to show you this graph, and then let's get to some how-tos so that you can start the conversation. Power constructs of racism. The first construct, the broadest construct of racism, is systemic. Okay, I love that one of you in the chat box just put that the birth defect of the United States of America is racism. I really like that. Absolutely. It is a birth defect, right? And it is something that we have got to fix, and we can fix. Racism is systemic. So when I say that white people are perpetuating racism, it's because white people in this country, for the most part, are literally driving the systems that makes this country go. Secondly, racism is institutional. The systemic racism power then penetrates into the institutions. So you're talking about hiring practices. You're talking about affirmative action. You're talking about how schools are put together, how prisons are put together. You're talking about where you put garbage disposals. You're talking about where pollution gets dumped to. You're talking about the water sources, all of the institutions, who gets hired, who doesn't. And then racism comes down to positional power. And here's what's so amazing to me. Positional power for racism means, and this is going to be a really hard one for you to take, my white brothers and sisters, but the fact that you are a white person in America gives you positional racism power. That means that whenever you step into somewhere as a white person, no matter how much money you have or don't have, the fact that your face is a white face means that you automatically get another privilege. You get another level of positional power in that situation. And then finally, this for me is what I would say the part of the work that keeps me going. Here's why I know that we can change this. Because racism in the power construct also consists of personal power. Here's what I want you to do. In this next conversation, how to have these conversations, you are going to have to rely on your personal power. Your personal power, which is your ability to do something about your life with intention and to intentionally decide that you're going to create change. That is your power to do. I'm asking you to use your personal power to make a decision to have that conversation with your family and your friends. That's a lot. We should just take a deep breath. It's a lot. Okay, let's move on now. How? How do we start? Where do we start, Dr. Verna? And give me some tools and tips. Preparing for the conversation, first of all, face your fear. I have found that white people, for the most part, are afraid of four things. One, they're afraid of dying. Two, they're afraid of heights. Three, they are afraid of public speaking. And four, they're afraid to have a conversation on race. That's what I've found. You've got to face your fear. You're going to be afraid. Here's what I want to say to you. Do this work afraid. Do it afraid. Secondly, I want to help you find your courage by doing what? Finding your personal power. Find the power in you to do this work. Please write this down. People may not, my white friends and families may not like me for a while, and it's okay, but they will come around. 4, look at yourself first and start the conversation with your internal self. Where are your privileges? How are you perpetuating racism? Where does it fit into your paradigm and your way of thinking? 5, do your racism research and homework. I've given you an overview, but my good people, there's a lot more, and I'm going to give you homework to do. Face your own racist reality. Face the fact that as a white person, you are in the race paradigm of perpetuating racism. What is your racist reality? Then I want you to listen to your own mind, listen to yourself, listen to speakers, listen to what's going on. Start journaling, start seeing racism. I challenge you to start seeing racism in yourself, in your family, in your home. Start seeing racism. And finally, I want you to be ready to face rejection and or hostility. Be ready to face rejection and or hostility. Now, my time says it is 12:56. However, I'm going to continue on with this work until 1:15. So for those of you who need to get off, please do get off. I will send you the rest of this conversation, but I want to be fair to you because we started the conversation really at 12:15 due to some technical difficulties. So I want to make sure that you get the most out of this conversation and that we have time to actually work on this other piece, which is the how-to. Is that fair? Give me a thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up. Give me a yes in the chat. Like, yes, you're good to go. You're going to stay on. This is great. Okay? Yes, yes, yes. Perfect. Great. Thanks. All right. I'm going to move on now to how-tos. So we talked about preparing for the conversation. It's very important to do this preparing. Okay? It's very important. And in the preparing for the conversation part, you may get quiet, and it's okay to get quiet. It's okay to take a little time to figure this out, to sort it out. And I welcome you. Send me an email. I welcome you to make a phone call to me. I welcome you to invite me to come in and even have a further conversation with you and your teams. I welcome all of that. How to start the conversation, part 1. There are multiple parts of this. Number 1, spend time observing and listening to your white friends and neighbors. Do they talk about race? If so, how? What are their attitudes? What are their prejudices about racism, about race? What is their race narrative? How are they reacting to current events? What are they saying about the riots? What are they saying about the protests? What are they saying? How are they talking about race right now? Spend some time observing and listening to their conversations. And don't just spend time doing all that work without documenting it. Document it so that when you actually start the conversation, you actually have some things to hinge your conversation on, and you know who you're talking to, right? You know who you're talking to. We have, good friends who I can have serious, I would say conversations that are non-filtered conversations about race, about racism, and they can be for real and say to me what it is they need to say to me. Listen, the place of being honest in this conversation and learning how to listen for it is very, very important. It's a part of you knowing how to be intentional about starting the work. Secondly, this is going to take some time. Formulate your own racism story. What is your racism story? How have you been a part of the problem? How can you be a part of the solution? How have you perpetuated racism? There is a very well-known man in this work, and by the way, both Ron Chisholm and this other gentleman work with an organization called the People's Institute on Race, and his name is Tim Wise, and he actually talks about how it is that he thought his mother was like a fully liberal white woman who was like down for the cause, so forth, so on, so forth, so on. And then, as it turns out, she becomes an Alzheimer's patient. And toward the end of her life, as she begins to literally forget almost everything, she literally forgets almost everything. She forgets the names of her children, her grandchildren, and her health begins to deteriorate. And this woman who literally in her conscious self, had been against racism almost all her life. But in her early self, in her early ages, she was implicitly taught as a white woman, as a white child, how to be a racist. And here she is at the very end of her life, and you can certainly, his name is Tim Wise, and you can certainly look him up and read about his work and actually read this story in depth. But toward the end of her life, what would come out of her mouth? Because all of the assistants in the care facility who were coming to feed her food, who were coming to change her bed and to change her, they were all African-American women. And The racism that was embedded into the internal structure of her mind, it still lurked back there. And here she was, this woman who had done so much good work, but somewhere in there, maybe she had never done her own racism story, her own racism work. And here she is, the last set of words that she would find to say as she lost everything was to call her Black brothers and sisters who were tending to her needs out of their name on a consistent basis. Out of their name, calling them the N-word on a consistent basis. And it's a sad reality, but when I talk about your racism story, I'm talking about you being for real about what has happened to you, what's been taught to you, how have you put that into your unconscious self. You know, there's a lot of talk about, microaggressions and and da. Here's the real. The reality is that what's really going on is that in your unconscious self, there is a racism story back there. There are racism messages back there. And what I want you to do is I want you to pull them out. I want you to write your racism story. I want you to find a way to document that for yourself. You don't have to show it to me. And at some point, I'm going to ask you to share that story with your friends and your neighbors. Here's why. In this work around white people doing racism work and anti-racism work, often what happens is that other white people somehow think that you have abandoned the community. And the truth is that you really haven't. What you've done is you've joined the global community in actually persisting to make things better, to eradicate this thing, this horrible thing that's in our society, and you want to erase it, but you can't erase it without first starting with you. Asking yourself the question, how have you perpetuated racism? What are you doing to dismantle racism in your own home and in your own family? What are you doing? And how are you raising your children to dismantle racism? That becomes a really, really critical point. Not only how you're doing that in your own life, but now take a look at your immediate family. How are you dismantling that? Now, if I were talking to your employees, for example, I would say to your employees within your work teams, how are you perpetuating racism? Every work team needs a racism story. What is yours? What is yours? How are you perpetuating racism? And are you continuing to recreate the racism cycle over and over and over in your organization, in your business, within your employees? How is it? You know, when corporations tell me, there's no one in the pipeline, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? There are many, many, many African-American people, Black people who are incredibly talented and educated and amazing and ready to have that job. The question is, though, when their applications went through, who were the gatekeepers of the applications? And they don't recognize the name, or it's unfamiliar. Then maybe they just don't even give it a second chance. Could this be happening? This is happening, absolutely. How to start the conversation, part 1. Now, let me go to part 2. And by the way, I'm sending this all to you, so no worries, this is coming to you, I'm sending it out as soon as we're done here. Part 2, choose one. When I say one, I mean one. Do not, let me say this again, do not try to have this conversation with a large group of people. Do not start that way. You will get your feelings hurt. You will walk away feeling rejected. You're going to be mad at somebody. And then somehow you're going to blame Dr. Verna and say, Dr. Verna, you told me to have this conversation. Nobody likes me. None of that's going to happen, right? Just choose one. And choose one friend or neighbor who you feel as though you can trust and talk to, who you respect, right? And just start with just one person. Secondly, when you have this conversation, because it's intention, remember we talked about intention, start with intention. When you have this conversation, do not, don't just have it on the, like, you're just like sideline conversation, like you happen to see someone in the grocery store. That's not the place to have the conversation. Intentionally choose a setting, choose a comfortable setting. And do not try to do this work when you're angry or outraged. Oh my goodness. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Anger and outrage to have the conversation doesn't work. Now, as a motivator to actually get the conversation started, which is why we're here right now, I do not believe that I would be doing this session right now, that people would have registered, you would have registered for this session and paid your money for this session had we not had that assassination of George Floyd. I do not believe we would have been here, because I do not believe that the blinders, the awakening would have happened. We would have continued in our racial racism power paradigm. So I'm so thankful that out of all of this terrible stuff that's going on, out of all this pain that's going on, that I do believe that there is an awakening of which we all, white people, are going to do more of this work to eradicate this thing and get this thing out of here, and that we together, Black and white people, can now begin to recreate our society. That's a really big vision. But why? I'm passionate about it, and I'm also compassionate too. And in this work, you have to be both. You have to be compassionate about the work, but also compassionate. Here's what I know. Everyone has their own level of understanding about racism. Everyone has their own level of which they are comfortable in talking about it. And your level, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being that you are not ready at all to have a conversation. You've never had one, and it scares you like nobody's business to even try. Even getting on this on this workshop was a huge deal for you. And or 10, you've been in this work. You know how to do this work. You could be doing this workshop with me, absolutely. Wherever you are, just know, give your people an opportunity to find themselves on that continuum, and don't blame or shame them. Be compassionate. Work with them to get up to a higher level in terms of having a conversation. So be in a comfortable setting. Don't try to do this work when you're angry or outraged. 3, start by sharing your own racism story. This is how you start. You start sharing your own racism story with your neighbors and your friends, which is why you only choose 1. And you have that conversation with them. Once you've shared your story, now start to ask them, your neighbors and friends, start asking about their reflections, their feedback, their ways of how did they hear? What comments do they have? What questions do they have? Use your own racism story as a way to jump off into these other things. And as a matter of fact, as you use your racism story, you're also, because there's so much teaching work to be done in terms of racism, you are also little but slowly but surely teaching your white brothers and sisters about what racism is not, how racism functions, and how they are perpetuating racism. Because here's what I've found about white people. There is not one white person who wants to be called a racist. Not near one. And I understand that, but at the same time, as we do this work, we can make that case without people running away from it. Because if they run away from it, they continue to perpetuate it and the work is never done. So number 4, use your own story as a way to jump off the conversation. I want to share one more slide with you, and then we're going to wrap up. I want you to be ready in the chat box to give me one word or statement that you got out of today's session that struck you, that you want to take and put into your life today. So just think about that. And I'm going to share one more slide with you in terms of your racism work. Here are some guiding questions that you can use when talking about racism. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm sending you these questions, but this is a way for you to get started. Asking your friends and neighbors, what does racism mean to you? What does that mean to you? First, they'll think that it's kind of strange as you're asking them that question, but once they begin to understand where you're coming from, it will be a question that they can move into. Because here's what I know. The more you start talking about it and understanding it, the more you will do about it, and it will create change. So here are what questions. This is just getting the information in terms of guiding questions. And then there's a whole bunch of them there. And then there are so what questions. These are the questions that helps you understand why people do what they do, why they think the way they do, why you think how you do, right? The so what piece is you making sense of this information. So what? Why is racism still a major issue in our society? I just thought of a new one. Just now, right? How is racism right at this moment continuing to perpetuate riots and protesting? How is racism doing that right now? Write that as an additional question, right? Love this one. How do you practice racism? This is a so what. This is understanding the why, not just what it is, but why is this happening? Why and how does it work? This is the analysis piece. This is the critical thinking piece for you to think about it. And then we come to the last piece, which is now what? Now that you know what's going on with you as it relates to racism, now that you know why it's happening, what are you going to do about it? How will you help? How will you impact the work? What will you do to raise your children to be anti-racist? What is your personal anti-racism vision for your family and neighbors? You should have one, absolutely. That as far as you're concerned, here's my vision for my family. Here's my anti-racist vision for my family and my friends. This is the now what piece. Are you going to do this in a day? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Where do we start? What are your action steps? First, study. Take your time, study, do the research. Your questions I will respond to in a video, which I will send to you, which will be available to you for a time. Second, listen. Listen to yourself, listen to others. And third, start the conversations. I have many resources for those of you who know me. I'm an author. These are resources. I will send them to you in the workshop handouts, but these are the resources that are available to you. And then also, I'd also recommend that you subscribe to my podcast. Every week, I have a virtue and something for you to think about and put into your life, which will be very helpful. I also have resources here available to you, which are going to be very helpful to you. And then let's continue the conversation. Let's continue the conversation. I'm just going to read some of these to you in terms of something. There's some questions. Just if someone would just send me one thing you got out of today that you want to put into your life and that you want to, that struck you today. Just send me one or two things, anyone, something that you got out of today as a way of finishing up our time. And thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you and I appreciate the work that you are doing. Reflection, define my own racism story. Thank you, Pam. That's great. Writing my own racism story. Jade, excellent. All start to have the world. One intentional work is needed. Yep. I started a plan for positive change. Excellent. These are all excellent. I want to thank you all. Here's our next steps. You'll receive a recording of this workshop, of this work. I want you to start the work. Please send me emails and or a phone call. Let me know how we continue this conversation. I will also respond to your questions in a video, which I will be sending to you in the next week or so. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate you. Go and get this work done. Have a good day.